Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mary Hartnett, and I'm the Executive Director of Clean Elections Minnesota. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works for an inclusive and healthy democracy in Minnesota. Among our goals are limiting the power of big and dark money in our political process, expanding voter access, and ensuring that Minnesota voters have access to truthful information about elections by fighting disinformation. We at Clean Elections Minnesota, along with our co-sponsors, We Choose Us, Common Cause Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, the Minnesota Humanities Center, and Third Act Minnesota, are very concerned with how disinformation from a variety of sources is distorting our political process. That's why several months ago, we hosted a session on artificial intelligence and elections with Dr. Darrell West of the Brookings Institute. We believe disinformation, whether from social media, newspapers, television, or personal interactions, is a very serious threat to democracy in our communities, our state, and our nation. And Minnesota legislators agree. With broad bipartisan support, in 2023, we became one of the first states to prohibit the use of deepfake audio or video ads during political campaigns. It is also up to every one of us to combat disinformation by seeking out the truth. As individuals, we need to avoid passing on disinformation and misinformation ourselves. Good policies and good candidates shouldn't need lies or distortions to win public support. One of our nation's best authorities on disinformation is tonight's speaker, Barbara McQuade, author of Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. She teaches at the University of Michigan Law School, is a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and co-hosts the podcast Sisters-in-Law. After years as a federal prosecutor, she served from 2017 to 2020 as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, the first woman to do so. We are very pleased that Professor McQuade will be interviewed tonight by Lori Sturdevant, longtime, highly respected editorial writer and columnist from the Star Tribune newspaper. Lori spent several decades as a reporter covering state politics and government, and is an author and three-time Minnesota Book Award winner. Lori?
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you to Clean Elections Minnesota and the other sponsors of tonight's event. Barb, what a treat it is for me to speak with you. I'm a huge fan of the hashtag Sisters-in-Law podcast. You and Jill and Joyce and Kim are my regular Saturday morning walking companions. So it's a treat to talk to you in person and to learn more of what you have been researching here so thoroughly. Congratulations and thank you for Attack from Within. Well worth people checking out. It really zeroes in on this growing use of intentional falsehoods as a political weapon in our country. Tell us, why a book on this topic for you, and why now?
Well, thanks so much, Lori, and thank you to Mary and Drew and everybody for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really thrilled to be with all of you. And Lori, I respect your work so much. I'm really thrilled to be able to be in this conversation with you. But as for why this book and why now, I spent my career as a national security prosecutor. I now teach national security law at the University of Michigan Law School. And one thing that I perceive is this growing threat of information warfare through disinformation. There was a time when I first started teaching this topic in 2017, 2018, when I thought of disinformation as being something that came only from our hostile foreign adversaries. But now it seems that disinformation is something that we are seeing Americans using on each other. It's done to deliberately deceive us and manipulate us. And so what I wanted to do is to write a book that is accessible for everyone so that people can recognize these tactics, identify them, and build some resilience so that we are less likely to be deceived by them.
Well, your book is rich with evidence. You amass a lot of examples of this phenomenon. For a long time in my columns and in editorials, I would decry the rise in attack ads, how negative our politics is becoming. And I wonder if what you're describing is just an extension of the kind of negative politics that has become so commonplace in this country, or is this something else again?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a both and situation. I think one of the reasons the problem is so acute today is because of the technology that allows us to do these things. With social media, people can send a message instantly, reach millions of people, can even do so anonymously. So we all have at our fingertips the power to do this. But I think the part that jives with what you're saying is this polarization we find ourselves in America. And, I think we have been slowly descending into this place since the 1990s. It used to be, Lori, that we saw politicians in the primary elections really work to cultivate their base. Republicans would work on the conservatives and Democrats would work on the liberals. But then when the general election came, they would tack back toward the middle and they would try to cultivate support from independents and moderates and the persuadable independent voters. But one of the things that politicians started to do in the late 1990s is, as more data became available, they were able to measure things more finely. And one of the things that has proved to be the better bet now is to give up on the middle and to double down on the base, even in the general election. And the data shows that if you can get people to simply turn out, those people who are reliably in your camp, that's a better bet than trying to convince these middle of the road voters who might vote for you and might vote for your opponent. So what we'd rather do is excite the base by getting them furious and outraged and angry. And, the other side is the devil and is the demon and this is an existential election for the soul of America. What happens is the base shows up because they get the message and they want to support their candidate. And the middle becomes cynical and disengaged and sometimes say, I'm not going to vote at all because I don't like either of these candidates.
Well,
and that may be a recipe for success in campaigns. It's a terrible recipe for governing.
Well, that's right. And this difference between politics and governance seems like it's only gotten bigger and wider in our society, in our system, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think another thing that it has been really growing in our society in recent years also is the way we pay for campaigns. Since the Citizens United decision in 2010, which really opened the floodgates to dark money and super PACs, there's now so much money in elections. A lot of it is lacks transparency, so we don't know where this is coming from. And so we can see people having outsized influence in our elections because of the money that they are able to spend to support candidates. So often there are issues that the public agrees on, common sense gun reforms, for example, and yet it's impossible to get anything passed in Congress because no one wants to run afoul of the NRA or the powerful gun lobbies who can afford to put up a primary candidate against somebody and knock them out of office. And so I think campaign finance is another area that is causing our politics to become so angry and so hyperbolic.
I know you've done some research about the psychology behind all of this. Why do these tactics work?
Yes. So, a lot of the tactics that are used by people who propagate disinformation, a lot of these tactics have been used for centuries against people. But there are a lot of cognitive biases that we have that psychologists will tell you can be preyed upon by manipulators who know what they're doing. So one of those things is fear. People fear losing what they believe to be rightfully theirs. And it's understandable. We all want, shelter. We all want prosperity. We all want health. And if there is something that threatens to take that away from us, that will get us motivated to go out and vote. And so that is one of the things that you hear from politicians. So many of these ads, these attack ads, start with that spooky music. It might show their opponent in black and white and dark grainy images, even show flames or something. It's all designed to stoke fear in all of us. And so that can be a powerful motivator about why some of these tactics work. Another is conspiracy theories. We are wired to believe in conspiracy theories. It's part of our survival instinct. If we see dark clouds gathering in the sky, we conclude based on prior experience that that means a storm is coming and we know to take shelter. It's the same kind of thing that motivates us to have implicit biases, and based on stereotypes, we make assumptions about people. It's why we need to educate ourselves and manage our own implicit biases. But it's those same kinds of things, it's a desire to believe that there is order in the world, that things don't just happen randomly and without coincidence. That makes us very easy to believe when someone suggests that there is a conspiracy, that COVID vaccines are all designed to control you or make you magnetic or whatever it may be. People are suspicious of our government. And so when someone gives them a theory, we tend to believe it. And then I'll mention just one more, Lori, and that is confirmation bias. We tend to recognize, notice, and remember things that are consistent with our views and to disregard the things that are not. I have a sister who is chronically late. If we are having a family gathering or getting together for dinner or whatever it is, she is always late. And I comment on it and I tell her, "What, you're late again?" And she has said to me, "You never notice when I'm on time." And I think she's right. It's because in my head, she's the late one. And so I tend to only notice when she's late, and when she's on time, no big deal. And we move on. It's something that I learned in law enforcement about how dangerous it can be to investigate crimes with an assumption in mind. If you think that you know who the suspect is, you will tend to pay attention to the clues that support that conclusion and to ignore some of the evidence that might suggest that that person's innocent and that someone else might be the perpetrator of the crime. So it's so important to keep an open mind. And I think that same thing is true when it comes to our views about politics. We might have a worldview that one party or the other is the party of law and order, or is the party of patriotism, or is the party of God, whatever we think it is. And we tend to see those things and they reaffirm our biases about those things. And because political operatives know those things, they can manipulate us by using images or messages that reinforce those biases.
Well, it's probably not a coincidence that this disinformation trend has arisen at the same time that social media has become so pervasive. Social media algorithms play on the very same human nature traits that you've mentioned. But is with artificial intelligence now coming at us rapidly, are we about to see things get worse?
Boy, let me say one thing about artificial intelligence. So often the articles or the speeches or the talks we hear on the topic of artificial intelligence is all about the doom and gloom of artificial intelligence. And it's certainly a potential weapon. But I also think artificial intelligence presents wonderful opportunities. It is going to help us cure diseases, provide medical treatment, solve crimes, lead to scientific discovery, maybe help us with climate change. So artificial intelligence, reduce auto accidents, has all kinds of great possibilities. But like every new invention, it can be abused. It can be used as a weapon as well as a tool. And anytime there's a new invention, there will be some problems that get created along with it. To invent the airplane is to invent the plane crash. And so I'm sure we will see artificial intelligence used in our elections in ways that will be harmful. Already, I think we are seeing some of these things. When it comes to election interference, in my research, I found that there are generally three broad categories. One category is to influence the outcome, to tell you, one candidate is bad or another candidate is good, and trying to influence your views. Another is to sort of dampen turnout, because that could have an impact in the outcome. If I dampen turnout in particular communities, then that might help a different candidate win the race. And then the other is just to simply sow discord or to undermine public confidence in elections altogether. And so I think we could see all of those brands of artificial intelligence being used. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. In the New Hampshire primary this year, there were robocalls that were generated with artificial intelligence to sound like the voice of Joe Biden. And they're pretty good. I've listened to them. I don't know if you've heard of it, complete with references to malarkey and all kinds of things. And in these robocalls that were sent to homes, people got the message that Joe Biden was telling them to stay home from the primary, don't vote, don't waste your vote, save it for the general election. Now, first of all, that makes no sense because you can vote in both. But it is, it was perhaps a test run. It goes back to a speaker, the person who created the voice was in Florida, and the person who created the recordings is in Texas. So this is American on American disinformation. And you could imagine that that could have a dampening effect on the turnout of likely Biden voters. Imagine if on election day in November, a group of voters got a message that said, this is your polling place calling. The power is out here. So you should come vote on Wednesday instead. You could imagine the harm that that could cause, especially in a swing state with a potentially narrow margin of victory, and if it's targeted against likely voters of one party or the other. And so I think we're going to start seeing some of this. There's been others. Here in Michigan, there was a candidate, I don't know that he was trying to fool anybody, but he had a political ad that really backfired. He mimicked the voice of Martin Luther King. And he used, I have a dream. My dream is that candidate such and such gets into office. And people were just offended at that one. So it really backfired on him, and he's officially apologized. But there have been instances in some smaller races of people who have, posted recordings of what sounded like their voice in a racist rant that they never gave, but sharing it with people online to say, listen to this guy, what a racist, listen to what he said when he thought no one was listening. And so you can imagine, especially in smaller races where it might be harder to detect and rebut those claims, especially in the way we live in our echo chambers online, it could be that the candidate who's targeted never even learns about it until it's too late. So I think, yes, despite the fact that artificial intelligence is this potentially wonderful tool, it can also be a terrible weapon. And I think we're going to see it in this election cycle.
Well, in Minnesota, we paid particular attention, actually, to this episode that you referenced in New Hampshire, where the consultant got caught with an ad imitating Joe Biden's voice, telling people not to vote. That was done by the consultant who was employed by Dean Phillips's presidential campaign. Dean Phillips, the 3rd District Congressman from Minnesota, Dean Phillips repudiated the whole thing, said it wasn't him, the consultant was acting on his own, but it was certainly a black eye. And maybe in Minnesota, we are a little more conscious of this as well because of what Mary Hartnett mentioned at the beginning. That is that we had state legislation in 2023 trying to crack down in advance on this phenomenon by prohibiting deep fake advertising 90 days before an election. Does that kind of state initiative have value in this as we face this problem?
Oh, absolutely. And I really applaud Minnesota for getting ahead of the curve. There are a few other states who have various statutes on the books, some like yours that prohibit these kinds of things 90 days by campaigns, within a sort of cooling off period leading up to an election. There are others that prohibit anybody from creating a AI generated ad, deep fake, without the consent of the person depicted there. Some provide civil remedies that a lawsuit is available. Some provide criminal penalties. So I think it's a great idea because, if you wait for Congress to act, you might be waiting a long time. And I think that's because there are some people who want to create mischief in the voting systems. And so, it would be wonderful if we could get Congress to pass a comprehensive bill on this that would give us uniformity around the country. But I think in the meantime, states are wise to act, and in some ways, states being leaders in this is wonderful because we have the possibility of, 50 different laboratories to experiment with these things and see what works best. Where was this disinformation in advertising through AI deterred? Where was somebody able to be held accountable? Where did it expose the use? And I think by having different statutes in different states, that will actually give us some evidence about how well some of these things will work. Certainly there will probably be some things that are sent from overseas that might be more difficult. I think that getting the social media platforms themselves to label things that are generated with AI would be better, but probably requires sort of a federal comprehensive view. But I think in the meantime, what you've done in Minnesota is really terrific and will help safeguard the voters in Minnesota so that they are not improperly influenced by fake ads generated with AI.
Well, thanks for that encouragement. And I'm wondering whether the First Amendment is a particular impediment to states like Minnesota that try to do something about this.
I think as long as it requires I think labeling is fine. And I think in Minnesota, you actually ban it 90 days, or is it labeling? Yeah, banning could be tricky. You remember the case, in fact, it's Citizens United that had a law that prohibited something, was 60, 90 days ahead of time. And the film that they wanted to show was some, Hillary Clinton hit job movie that was at the, that's what Citizens United wanted to be able to show. And that was struck down. So I suppose there is some possibility there. But I think one thing that's important to remember, and that is it's if you can find ways to distinguish your own law from a law that has been previously struck down, then I think you can act in good faith. Because remember, like all constitutional rights, the First Amendment is not absolute. If the government has a compelling governmental reason and the law is narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling reason, then the law complies with the First Amendment. And so I think that it's worth a try, especially if you have a good faith basis for distinguishing it from the law that was struck down in the Citizens United case.
Well, your book does a great job talking about sort of the four big areas of threat that this represents, the biggest being the threat to our democracy. Americans govern themselves with this flood of disinformation coming at them. You also talk about national security and public safety, our international reputation, and the rule of law. But I want to invite you to talk about those sort of in order here. The big threat being to democracy. Can we function? Can we govern ourselves if we allow disinformation to run wild?
Yeah, so great question to tie it to the harms that we're seeing. So number one, democracy. I mean, at most direct, what we've already discussed, which is preventing people from exercising an informed vote because they've received false information about a candidate or the race or democracy or the count altogether. So that's a problem. But it's also being used, Lori, as a pretext to pass laws making it more difficult to vote. I think gerrymandering is a form of disinformation. But if you look at states after 2020 who passed laws making it harder to vote, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin, all of those were based on the false pretext that they were necessary to prevent voter fraud, which of course is non-existent because they said of all the voter fraud in 2020, even Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia, who I consider one of the heroes of 2020 because he stood up to Donald Trump when he was trying to get the state to change the vote and submit a new slate of electors in Georgia, who said at the time that the 2020 election was accurate, it was fair, it was secure. And yet when the legislature put forth this legislation to make it more difficult to vote in Georgia, with fewer days of early voting, fewer places to deposit a ballot, prohibiting food and water for people who are standing in line, all kinds of crazy things like that. He said the reason he was signing the bill was to stop all the voter fraud. There's no voter fraud. And so if you're passing this legislation and it is not because there is voter fraud, then what is the real reason? And I submit that the reason is it is an effort to suppress the vote, this idea of dampening voter turnout among various groups of likely Democratic voters, people who are the poor, racial minorities, people who have two jobs, students, people on Native American reservations who have long distances they need to travel to vote. So all of these states who are passing these voter integrity laws, I think are engaging in disinformation in a way that harms democracy, which I think we would agree, the Supreme Court has said the Constitution requires one person, one vote, and to suppress someone's vote, I think is anti-democratic. Moving on to national security, when people see and lose confidence in democracy and in elections, it harms us on the world stage. Since World War II, it has been the foreign policy of the United States to lift up democracies around the world. It's why we participate in NATO. It's why we do democracy building all over the world. And yet after the 2020 election and that attack on the Capitol on January 6th, we lost a lot of stature around the world. An official in Russia said, the United States can no longer hold itself out as the model for democracy. American democracy is limping on both feet. In China, President Xi said this 2020 election and this attack on the US Capitol is evidence that democracy does not work. You cannot get people to agree on everything. And in fact, democracy isn't the point. The point is prosperity. And a better way to achieve prosperity is with a strong leader. Of course, he didn't mention that in China, they lock up dissidents and protesters and journalists who don't agree with the dear leader. So it has been harmful to our national security, because the reason we lift up democracies around the world is that we believe that when other countries are engaged in democracy, we have fewer wars, fewer refugee crises, and more and better trade partners. And yet what we are seeing now around the world is democratic backsliding in a number of countries, a number of European countries. I mean, France and Italy and Turkey and Hungary are all experiencing democratic backsliding. And I think that is something that is very concerning and should be concerning to foreign policymakers in the United States.
Well, absolutely. And then something that's close to your heart, and that's the rule of law. You make a special point of saying this kind of disinformation is really harmful to America's continued rule of law.
Yeah. And let me talk about that for a second. You know, we certainly disagree about lots of things in this country, and that's fine. We can have spirited debate. And when we want to resolve disputes, we have a couple of ways we do that. We do it at the ballot box, and we do it in courts of law. And in court, when I was a prosecutor, any assertion I made had to be backed up by facts. I couldn't just make stuff up. I couldn't just say things. I had to have evidence, documents, objects, people, testimony that could support what I had to say. And the laws are passed and are applied equally to everyone. But what we are seeing now are people attacking public confidence in our police, in our FBI, law enforcement, Department of Justice, and our courts. I mean, I don't want to be partisan, and I don't suggest to anybody that they vote for one candidate or another. But, you know, in recent days in court, we have heard Donald Trump make very disparaging comments about the court system, about particular judges, about prosecutors, and even about the FBI. When his home at Mar-a-Lago was searched in August of 2022, the next day, a man posted online that all great patriots needed to take revenge upon the FBI, and he himself showed up at the office of the FBI in Cincinnati with an assault weapon. He was chased away and later killed in a standoff with police. And so when people don't believe in the rule of law, it tends to cause people to want to take the law into their own hands, which can spark vigilante violence. I cite that man in Cincinnati as an example. But of course, the greatest example of all was on January 6th, when people, despite court decisions finding that the election was fair in 2020, despite audits, they believed that the election had been stolen because they were told that repeatedly in a number of forums by a number of people. And so they attempted to use brute force to obtain the result they could not obtain in court, and that is to deny the certification of Joe Biden as president. That is a violation of the rule of law. And if you take that to its extreme, I mean, think about where that leads us. That leads us into a country where people who are the strongest, the most powerful physically or financially or politically, will simply get their way by using force against the rest of us. That is not the country that was founded by our founding fathers.
Well, that's right. And I want to invite our listeners to join us in this conversation by putting a question in the Q&A feature on the Zoom, on the base of the Zoom screen. And we'll be screening those questions and try to get to a few of them before our hour is over. I think you've really convinced me, and I'm sure you've convinced the readers of your book, that disinformation is something that we need to check. But we need to know how best to insist on the truth in this country, insist on the truth in our politics, in our public discourse. When I was in journalism school, we were told that the remedy for bad speech, misleading speech, is more speech. Is that
Sure.
still true?
I think so. You know, I think that there are some regulations on social media that are necessary, but they don't relate to content. I think they relate more to processes, because I think we have to be mindful of not running afoul of the First Amendment, because I share your view, Lori, that the First Amendment is a cherished right, and that often the best way to rebut bad information is through good information. Although, of course, as we said before, no right is absolute. And so things like threats and perjury and fraud and conspiracy, despite the fact that they utilize speech, are still crimes. So it's not an absolute right. But I do agree with you in general that just because someone says something false or offensive doesn't mean we should censor it, but we should correct it. And I think there are a number of things that we can do to address this problem. As I mentioned, I think regulation of social media is long overdue. In 1996, the law that currently governs social media was passed. And in 1996, social media platforms were given legal immunity for anything that is placed on their platforms. And the reason was that we wanted to foster innovation and investment in internet service providers, whatever that would be, at a time when people couldn't even imagine what form that would take. But now here we are, almost 30 years later, and things look very different. And so, maybe it's time to rethink the way we regulate social media. It's I sometimes say it's sort of like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. It's adorable when it's a baby, and then it grows into a man-eating predator. It's time to do something different about how you're handling it. And I think the same is true with social media. And so, my book, I discuss in some detail regulating the algorithms that are designed to stoke outrage as revealed by a Facebook whistleblower. Regulating the way our private data is scraped and sold to data brokers, who in turn sell it to commercial entities and political operatives, but as a result are able to micro-target us with content that they know will push our buttons. I think eliminating bots, the artificial intelligence created accounts that are online that look like real people with names like, Patriot Girl or Minnesota Mama, whatever they are, and they look real, but in fact they're just created by some user, and they're designed to amplify by liking and sharing their false content so that it looks more popular than it is, and it has a bigger reach. Or it's designed, programmed to pick fights with you. If you post something about gun control, it'll start calling you all kinds of awful names, and then if you're fighting with it, you may not even realize that you're simply fighting with software in a very public way online. I think there are things we can do online by requiring disclosure of ads. Who is paying for ads online? We require the disclosure of the source of payment for ads on television and radio, but not online. You might hear one of those, I'm Joe Biden and I approve this ad, or I'm Donald Trump and I approve this ad. I'm Amy Klobuchar and I approve this ad. Same is not true on social media. And so that would be a way of preventing, the big dollar figures, the big super PACs from looking like there's some sort of grassroots organization, and instead, instead of who they are. Those are some things on sort of the supply side of disinformation, but I also think there's some things we can do from the demand side. One of those things is improving our own media literacy. In Finland, where they've been bombarded with false information from Russia for decades, they have introduced media literacy into their schools with great success. I think we also need to improve or restore our civics education. I've read that we now spend in America 5 cents on civics education for every $50 we spend on STEM education. Certainly STEM education is worthwhile and perhaps more costly than civics, but 5 cents, there are a lot of schools that don't teach it all together. And I think if people understood civics a little better, they might be a little less likely to fall prey to some of the false claims.
Yeah.
And then
we've been beefing up civics education in Minnesota at the state level, and have so our state government wants to work in this realm. I wonder, can the state do much about social media regulation, or does that have to happen at the congressional level?
Yeah, I think they can, but I think that there is, in the absence of congressional action, I think they can. There is a push for federal legislation to preempt state legislation, to say, we, Congress, the federal government, are going to own this space. And therefore, we are preempting states from getting involved in this. But until they do, in the absence of action, I think states are within their rights to take steps to protect their citizens from all of the kinds of harms that are online.
Well,
And one other thing, I was going to say, one other thing, Lori, that I think is a good solution that can prevent some of the extremism that gets promoted with disinformation is something else that Minnesota has been taking a lead on, which is really great, which is ranked choice voting. I know that you've got it there in Minneapolis, and it's really starting to catch on in some places. Maine and Alaska allow it in their statewide elections, including to select members of Congress, which I think is really amazing. And then I think there's something like 12 states that are now permitting it if cities want to do it, municipalities. And so something like 47 cities are doing it. And so kudos to Minneapolis for doing it, because as you know, it is a great way to weed out the extremists. It may be that you don't get your first choice, but everybody's second choice is probably somebody who's pretty good, and it prevents that splintering of there's two quite reasonable candidates who split the vote, and then one extremist who comes in and nods them out at 35% to their 33 and 33. Or 34 to their 33 and 33. And so I think that is an incredible innovation. I've seen it in a couple of cities here in Michigan, and I think it is a great way to prevent extremists from claiming power in the future. So kudos to Minneapolis for that.
Well, it's more than Minneapolis. It's St. Paul and about 4 or 5 other cities, and
Wonderful.
we are working at the legislative level to try to expand it. Something that I've been interested in as a columnist for a lot of years here.
Yeah, wonderful.
So thank you for endorsing something that we're pretty eager to see expand here in Minnesota. I'm going to try to take a few of these questions now that we're getting running out of time. And somebody had a rather specific question about the Stanford Internet Conservatory.
Yes.
A research entity that is studying disinformation. It apparently might have to shut down because of lawsuits and congressional inquiries. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So Stanford started an institute. They call it the Observatory for Disinformation. And it was started by Alex Stamos, who used to do information security for Facebook. And they have some really top researchers there. Renee DiResta is there, top researchers in disinformation. But one of the things that they have found is purveyors of disinformation have really started harassing them. They have filed frivolous lawsuits. They've been called to testify before Congress. They're losing grant funding and other things. And as a result, they recently announced that it is likely that they're going to be closing up shop. I think it's a really terrible thing. It reminds me of what happened in our Department of Homeland Security. Early in the Biden administration, they set up a disinformation agency. I forget what they called it. It didn't have a great name. And a woman named Nina Jankowicz, who's also one of these great researchers in the area of disinformation, was its director. And the goal was solely to look at foreign disinformation for fear of government running afoul of First Amendment rights and other kinds of things. But it very quickly came under fire by far-right politicians who said it was a censorship bureau, who called it the Ministry of Truth. And within 11 days, it shut down. And this director, Nina Jankowicz, was herself harassed, threatened, death threats, all kinds of things. And it's a really interesting thing that those who are trying to speak the truth are being so viciously attacked. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Darwinism, when Darwin is daring to expose the truth about creationism, that people want to shut it down. And so that's what's happening at Stanford. And you would hope that the folks at Stanford would stand up to that and try to help them withstand this assault. But I don't know if they're going to be successful, because it's so harassing. FOIA requests, freedom of information, they're constantly bombarded with all kinds of things that it makes it impossible for them to do their work.
Oh, that is a frightening story. It is a shame if Stanford, big institution that it is, can't help protect this entity from that kind of bombardment. A good question here from our listeners tonight. It is more kind of a personal level. As we encounter disinformation in political messaging, and we're pretty sure that's what it is, and we're in conversations with people who tend to believe that sort of thing, are vulnerable to believing that sort of thing. What advice do you have for helping people have those conversations, difficult conversations, convincingly assert that the truth is more important than this junk that they've been picking up and carrying on with?
Such a good question. And, I think it is something that all of us deal with. I will tell you all that my mother is in her 90s. And in 2016, she voted for Donald Trump because she believed that he was a successful businessman based on what she had seen on The Apprentice. And she has been someone I have had to have some candid conversations with about some of the things that she has believed or seen on television news or read or elsewhere. And I think she's really come around. And I think part of it is the need to speak to people with respect, the need to show some grace, and the need to understand you may not change their mind instantly. I also think it comes from a place of caring more about preserving the relationship than proving that you're right. So you're not going to brow people into agreeing with you, especially not in the first instance. Some of the things I learned in my work as a prosecutor. Number one, when someone makes an assertion, asking what evidence do you have of that claim? And so, in maybe more everyday language, what's the basis for believing that thing you just said is true? What do you base that on? And then also asking about the source. All right, so you say that, voting machines flip votes from Biden to Trump in the 2020 election. What is your evidence for that? I saw it on Fox News. How credible is that source? And then, perhaps reminding them that Fox News paid $770 million or something in a defamation lawsuit to Dominion Voting Systems. So that can help. The other thing that I learned as a lawyer in negotiations is it is rare that you reach agreement in the first meeting. And so the goal really should simply be to plant some seeds for future conversations. And maybe just get the person thinking. They may not admit to you because, one of these other cognitive biases that we have is that we're very stubborn and we don't like to admit when we're wrong. It may be shameful for us to admit that we're wrong. And so we may not be able to do that. But if you can just plant some seeds so that when the person walks away, they're thinking, Dominion voting, $770 million. Maybe I'm not so sure about this. Maybe I'm not right about this. If you can just get them to start questioning, that might be what success looks like. So I think you have to do it from a place of love and grace and respect. But I think we can get there. And I'll tell you one other thing, Lori, I think this is so important. We have to model the behavior that we want to see in the world. One of the things that I see so often on social media is from the right and the left, people who want to own their opponent. I'm going to dunk on them. I'm going to ridicule them and show you how foolish they are by making some clever retort to something they said. And, it'll generate likes and shares. People are, yeah, way to go, high five. That's great. But all it does is reinforce this coarse discourse. I think that we need to take the high road. It may not feel as good. It may not give us the instant gratification that we want. But I think that modeling good behavior, all behavior is contagious. And so, when people say awful, mean, insulting things, it's tempting to say those things back. But I think that, you can flip it on its head by taking the high road and speaking with grace and respect and love and hoping that message is just as contagious as the bad one.
Well, that's very well said, Barbara. I sure appreciate that. And it seems we need reminding that the goal of all this political discourse is governing this country together. We must govern it together. That's the mission of our democratic system here is to govern together. And we can't govern together if we're at each other's throats with misinformation. One of the questions that we have, it speaks particularly to the misinformation about elections themselves as a particularly pernicious thing, and wondering if we have to concede that there has been some fraud in our elections. How do you respond to questions about fraud in American elections?
Yeah, certainly, but it's not by the kinds of margins currently that would swing the outcome of an election. We have audits, we have lawsuits, so we have mechanisms for detecting, fraud in elections. And the cases that have been brought in recent years, onesies, twosies, there are small cases, and they do get brought because election integrity is such an important thing. But, the states have, ever since 2000, when we had the Bush v. Gore case and the hanging chads and all those kinds of things, Congress invested millions of dollars in election infrastructure to make sure that we have, the best machines, the best audits, good systems, reliable records backed up by paper. And so it's really, voter fraud is of such a small quantity as to be virtually non-existent, and certainly not a threat to throw the outcome of an election. So I think that's important to remember. I think one other thing that is a more recent phenomenon is that election laws keep changing. In recent years, I know here in Michigan, we've had all kinds of ballot initiatives to make it easier to vote. In some places, it's become harder to vote. And so it is easy, you could imagine, for voters, especially those who only vote every 4 years in a presidential election, to be confused about what the rules even are. And so I think one thing that all of us can do is to make sure that we know and that our friends and family know how to get accurate information about our elections. And so I often send people to our Secretary of State's website, your local county or city clerk's website, or another organization I really love is the League of Women Voters, who put out nonpartisan voter guides that give you accurate information about voting, because I think that just stoking confusion is something that could cause mischief in the upcoming election.
Well, that's very helpful advice. People are asking, what can we as individuals do? Knowing where to go for information about elections is certainly one such thing. Are there particular places that you send people, or that you yourself turn to when you're trying to fact check something to see if it's disinformation or reality?
I do. There are a number of great resources online where you can look things up. Lately, I've been really trying to get my arms around the Hunter Biden laptop, because there's so many things. It was admitted in his trial, and so I think certainly at least the files that the FBI used in that case are authentic. And then there's all the stuff that got into the hands of Rudy Giuliani. How do you figure it out? And there's some great places where you can find out at least what has been documented. And there's some things that are still unknown, but a few of these sites, one is called Snopes.com, and there's a search function where you can send in like Hunter Biden laptop, and it'll give you not only the most recent stories on it, but it will give you attribution as to where it was reported. We know this fact from this source, and we know that fact from another source. Here's what we don't know to this day. There's one called PolitiFact. There's one called factcheck.org. And there's another called Ground News. And what Ground News will tell you is it will rank the bias of the story, whether it's left, right, or center. And I think that's a really interesting way of measuring the accuracy of something. So those are some sources that I rely on for accurate information when I'm reading something online or in a newspaper.
Well, thank you. That's really good practical information. And then someone is asking, how do we hold candidates accountable for disinformation if we discover that a candidate is putting out material that is completely bogus? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I mean, one, of course, is to use our vote to send a message, right? If a candidate is engaging in disinformation, they don't get your vote. So I think that's one way. If voters won't stand for it, politicians will have to stop doing it. But I also think exposing people who are engaging it, I would suggest contacting the administrator of elections in your jurisdiction, whether that's citywide, countywide, or statewide, depending on the race. A lot of times the dirtiest tricks are at the lowest levels. For years, people have stolen yard signs. But I know that some of this disinformation is starting to make its way into city council races and other things. I was recently in Cleveland where a woman who was a candidate for city council showed me a video that was shared in like WhatsApp groups and things, so not posted online, but sent out to voters in groups in a way that was not terribly visible to others. She finally got a hold of it, and it was where she was, pounding the gavel at a meeting. It was because she was calling to order the meeting when it got unruly, but instead it said that she was yelling at African-American attendees at the meeting, which was not true whatsoever. But because of the way it was being pitched, it was shared online in this way to make her look very bad, in a very bad light. So sharing that with election officials in the particular jurisdiction, I think would be useful. You can also report it to the news media. As you
Let's
said,
say,
Lori,
call your
but-
friendly local reporter,
Yeah,
although there are fewer of those friendly local reporters
True.
right now. And that's another reason for concern, isn't it, Barb?
It is. In fact, I talk about this in the book about the role of local journalism and how important it is. And yet we are seeing a real shrinkage in local journalism, a phrase referred to as news deserts of places where they don't have any local journalism. And it's so important to have local journalism, I think, as part of the community building that helps us, to live together in society. I think, right now we live in this world where people are so polarized, living in our little echo chambers because we're not out sharing in community. We're working from home more. Our attendance is down in churches or other faith communities, labor unions, and other places where we might actually meet other people and get together. And one of those things that pulls people together is local journalism. Instead of having a reporter who's credible and trained and ethical, and an editor who knows how to edit the material covering the city council meeting or the road commission meeting, we probably get a blogger, at best, who's posting something on Facebook through their own eyes about what happened there. And that leads to all of these. You've probably seen these clips of people getting angry at the school board meeting and shouting and all these kinds of things. And we don't have people just providing accurate information about the business that is being conducted there. That's a really important role of local journalism. And I think we ought to really look for ways to bolster local journalism. The current business model hasn't been working. They were always based on an ad-based revenue model. And I think that we as a society ought to look for ways to subsidize local journalism through nonprofit foundations or government, if we can get, at an arm's length removal to avoid conflicts of interest, because I think local journalism is a really important part of civic society.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And one of our viewers tonight is noticing that some candidates are refusing now to engage with local journalism. And we've had that experience at the Star Tribune editorial board, my alum association, where candidates increasingly are refusing to come in for endorsement screenings,
Wow.
Just not wanting to participate. Can voters encourage candidates to play along with local journalists?
Yeah, well, again, I would submit that if, I would view that as a real ding on a candidate if they refuse to go in, to a credible newspaper with a track record of objectivity and refuse to sit for an interview. They assess the person's experience, the person's credentials, the person's ideas, their policy positions. And, it would cause me to question, what is it they're trying to hide that they're not willing to go in there and talk about that? So I don't suppose we can force them to do that. But I think as a voter, that would certainly be a red flag to me that there's something this candidate doesn't want me to know about them or doesn't want to be exposed. I suppose they'd rather take their message directly to the voters online. But, then you lack that objective and independent voice that is helping to endorse or not endorse candidates.
Well, I always thought it was good practice for candidates to face some tough questions, because if they're elected, that's certainly what their role is going to be. Someone else is remarking here about the role of election judges. And in Minnesota, it takes 30,000 election judges to run a general election.
Wow.
That means there are 30,000 allies to help us, I think, spread the word locally that elections are secure, they are well run. Do you have a thought about the role of election judges, Barb?
Boy, I think they're the heroes of democracy. In every state, we have all of these people, some paid a modest fee, some volunteers who show up on election day. They work long hours, at 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. or later, counters into the night. And one thing I'm a little worried about this election cycle is the threats that some of those people have been facing, especially the counters, the canvassing boards and others who have received death threats in 2020 amid accusations that election fraud was occurring. People at these counting sites, with the mail-in ballots. I know here in Michigan, they were subjected to threats. In Philadelphia, they were subjected to threats. I worry about those good people who are doing the, the legwork of democracy. In Georgia, there was Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who were working in the elections, who were falsely accused of Rudy Giuliani of engaging in voter fraud. Of course, they have collected, or I don't know if they've collected yet, but they received a judgment of many millions of dollars against Rudy Giuliani for defamation, for defaming their character and subjecting them to so much harassment. But I think that we need all of these people to help us administer elections. We can't do it without them. And my hat's off to them. They really are the heroes of democracy. And I think we need to do all we can to encourage people to do that work and to support them in every way we can.
Well, thank you. That's a good message. We're down to just a few minutes here, Barb. And so I wanted to ask you about a line that struck me toward the end of the book, where you commented that nothing really less than the survival of American democracy is at stake in this disinformation threat. And you argue, well, you say at one point that democracies sometimes die, and perhaps ours has outlived its natural life. And I thought, oh, gee, Barb is worried about how bad this has become. But as you've spoken about with Americans now, as you've talked with them about your book in recent weeks and months, I wonder whether tonight, are you feeling bullish or bearish about our system's ability to survive and to survive this threat and withstand and flourish in the years to come?
Yeah, bullish, but with an asterisk, and that is, it's not going to happen by itself. I have had the chance to get out and talk to a lot of people about my book, and it is encouraging to see how many people there are who are informed, engaged, and interested in doing something to protect democracy. We all saw what happened in 2020 and realized how close we came to a coup, really. I mean, it's not an overstatement to say that. And I think Liz Cheney said it best when she said that we cannot abandon truth and remain a free country. And so I am hopeful that there are enough Americans who care about truth, who care about democracy, who care about the rule of law, and who will work and fight for it. But I think one of the things we have to do is to get our own houses in order. And regardless of which political tribe you belong to, whether you are on the far right, the far left, or anywhere in between, I think that you have to commit to yourself that you are going to choose truth over your tribe, because that is what it's going to take to preserve democracy in America.
That is what democracy requires. Barb, you're certainly doing your part. Thank you very much for writing this book and for talking about it with us tonight. Thanks to Clean Elections Minnesota for hosting this forum, and thanks to our listeners for paying attention to us this evening. Good night, everybody.